Hello there, everyone. I am your host, the Sea Monster, and welcome to my essay video series on The Mummy, the 2017 film. The Mummy, as I just mentioned, was released in 2017. It was directed as well as co-written by Alex Kurtzman, and was intended to be the first film in the Dark Universe, a series intended to reboot the Universal classic monsters. So, this was a film that I really wanted to talk about for some time because of the curious case surrounding it, which I will get into after this little introduction portion. Just to give you guys a little bit of history here, I am a fan of the Universal Monsters franchise. I have a love for the monsters themselves as characters, and I have an immense level of respect and appreciation for the franchise and how it shaped the realm of cinema as we know it. So I was very much interested in seeing how Universal would pull off bringing back its most classic franchise for the modern era. And, well, I'm sure we can all gander how that endeavor turned out in the end. When it comes to reviews and analysis videos that discuss The Mummy 2017, there isn't really that much out there that really goes in depth on the film itself. There's plenty of video essays that discuss the concept that the film tried to be a springboard for, and its failure to do so, as well as its wasted opportunities. But not so much on the film itself. Now, of course, like many others, I will be going over the Dark Universe's failure to launch as a franchise, but what I hope to achieve here is to take a look into The Mummy 2017, the film itself, and really try to get an understanding of what it was trying to do beyond just being the start of a franchise that failed. Now, this series is going to be in 3 parts, as there is quite a bit for me to cover regarding this film. The allotted time that it will take for me to talk about this film is probably going to be more than what any other person on this platform would even consider. I guess if no one else out there is gonna do a multi-part essay video series on this film, then, in the words of Thanos, fine, I'll do it myself. So, in order to discuss The Mummy 2017, much like how I've done things in previous essays, I will be going into a brief overview on its history. Then I will look at the contents of the film itself in order to assess its overall objective quality, from its story and character work and how well those are executed, to the more technical aspects of the film, such as its visuals and set pieces, to whether or not the film succeeds in what it was intended to do, that being setting up the groundwork for a potential franchise, regardless of critical or financial reception. My own personal views will only play a small part into the discussion in order to reach a proper conclusion on the film's overall quality. So, now that we're formally introduced, as well as established our criteria, let's enter this movie's world of gods and monsters, and begin, shall we? The Mummy 2017 has had a rather interesting history in terms of what it was intended to be and how that sort of became its downfall to an extent. In order to really understand the film and look into it, we have to take into account the role that Universal played. After all, one does not simply talk about The Mummy 2017 without some level of an understanding of what it, as well as an introduction to the Dark Universe, entailed. For you see, the Universal Classic Monsters isn't just another old, iconic franchise that Hollywood has been trying to reboot several times over in the modern day or even in the past. It is the film franchise that essentially gave life to the sheer concept of a franchise. While the original run of Universal Monsters films may have had a convoluted and even loose and messy continuity, it was still a game changer in the realm of cinema back in the day. A lot of franchises that have persisted and have found success to this day, including but not limited to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Conjuring Universe, and the Monsterverse, owe their success to the Universal Monsters. So it's at least fair to see why Universal would want to take a crack at bringing back the franchise that put their studio on the map in the first place. Unfortunately, the Universal Monsters have had trouble in making a comeback in modern cinema, with several attempts at launching a potential franchise that have failed to pay off in a significant way, from Van Helsing to The Wolfman to Dracula Untold. The Brendan Fraser Mummy films and their Scorpion King spin-offs were the closest thing to a modern Universal Monsters franchise with any sort of longevity up to that point. After having one disappointment after another and seeing other film franchises find immense success, Universal wanted to join the trend of cinematic universes, and they wanted to badly. And so, in comes The Mummy, intended to start what would be called the Dark Universe. For this reboot of The Mummy, Universal wanted some sort of mix between the chiller aspects of the Boris Karloff film from 1932 and the action-adventure aspects found in the Brendan Fraser series, while also having it be a launching point for their new cinematic universe, in a similar style as the MCU. Back in the day, I was pretty skeptical of the idea of The Mummy being the start of this new franchise that Universal wanted to get off the ground, especially after finding out that Jekyll Untold was initially going to be the start of this franchise, but Universal decided to sweep that under the rug in favor of The Mummy. The marketing certainly didn't do much to sway me into seeing the film in theaters either. So when I heard of the film's failure to make back a profit, as well as the negative press surrounding it, I opted to just wait until it would come out on DVD and Blu-ray and watch it for myself that way. At the time, I figured it would at least be good reviewing fodder for my annual string of Halloween-themed movie reviews anyways. So, I waited. Then when The Mummy was released on home media, and when I finally sat down to watch it after renting it from Family Video, the good old days. I miss Family Video. Anyway, so, back on topic. So when I watched The Mummy 2017, I was surprised to find myself actually kinda liking it. Not to say that it was a groundbreaking, fantastic film by any stretch, or a film that could rival the classics in the Universal Monsters franchise, but I did find myself enjoying it as a Universal Monsters-themed action film. However, even during my first watch through, and despite my enjoyment of the film overall, the biggest problem with The Mummy 2017 was very apparent, and that is the fact that Universal was trying way too hard to play catch-up with Marvel, as opposed to carving out something that could be satisfying as a standalone entry, while also planting a seed of a promising franchise. And as a result, that led to the film turning out not as well as it potentially could or should have. As an action film on its own, with some DNA of the Universal Monsters sprinkled here and there, The Mummy 2017 is just fine. However, as a film intended to launch a franchise that is supposed to be Universal's equivalent to the MCU, there are some major missteps that were made here. Over time, I have come to the conclusion that The Mummy 2017 is objectively not a good film nor a bad film, but rather a film that falls somewhere in the middle. A film that, despite whatever personal enjoyment I may get out of it, is overall objectively average. Maybe even just okay. So the overall quality in The Mummy 2017 is certainly more complicated than falling in one side of the spectrum or the other. And so, I am here to discuss why that is the case. I'm not here to kick the film or the idea of the Dark Universe as a whole while it's down, nor am I here to sing all kinds of praises for this film like it's an unsung masterpiece, because it certainly isn't. I will levy criticisms where they're called for, while also giving the film credit where it's due, and then make a final statement in how the film measures up when everything is all said and done. Anyway, now that we've gone over all that background history and all them qualifiers, let's talk about the film itself from here on out. So yeah, let's get into this thing. So, let's start with a little plot summary. The Mummy 2017 is about a sergeant named Nick Morton who, along with his buddy, Corporal Chris Vale, uncover an ancient Egyptian tomb, which is considered to be rather unusual due to it being set in Iraq. Once Jenny Halsey, an archaeologist whom Morton slept with one night and stole a map from, comes into the picture, they go down to investigate this mysterious tomb. However, they find out that this tomb is actually a prison intended to hold a princess named Ahmanet, who murdered her own family out of revenge for being supplanted from her birthright to the throne. Before doing this, however, she also made a pact with Set, an insidious Egyptian god who seeks a host for her to put him in. Once Morton haphazardly unveils Ahmanet from her prison, she chooses him to be that potential host for Set. And so Morton and Halsey find themselves as targets of this undead mummy princess, which then leads them to go to London, where Morton meets Dr. Henry Jekyll, director of Prodigium, an organization founded to hunt, contain, and, if necessary, kill monsters and other forms of evil. All of this essentially introduces Nick Morton into a new world of gods and monsters. A fairly straightforward plot that certainly calls back to the 1999 Mummy film in certain areas, except with a slight gender swap, in that it is an action-oriented film with tinges of horror thrown in for good measure that does call back on occasion the 1932 Mummy film, or just the older Universal Monsters films in general. However, why don't we go just a little bit deeper? And a good place to start on that front is by discussing the film's characters. And in terms of discussing the film's characters, a good one to start with is our main protagonist, Nick Morton. So why don't we get into him, shall we? Nick Morton, played by Tom Cruise, is a sergeant in the U.S. Army of a less than chivalrous nature, for he, along with Vale, takes part in essentially a side gig, which involves stealing ancient valuables and selling them to the black market, as the film kinda blurts out to the audience via Courtney V. Vance. After setting Ahmanet free and becoming a victim of her curse, albeit unknowingly at first, Morton goes on to try to evade her as well as Prodigium. When Jenny Halsey is killed by Ahmanet, and when he's essentially put in a corner, Morton takes the gamble of letting himself become Set's vessel so that, through sheer will, he could potentially overcome the god's influence in order to defeat Ahmanet and bring back Jenny. He succeeds at both, but it's still at a great cost, as he insists on leaving so that Jenny could be safe, for he is still grappling with his newly acquired power. Afterwards, Morton is last shown to have brought back Vale as well, and the two go off on an adventure, likely to search for a cure for being the vessel of a deity. Now, there is a bit of a thematic core in this film, which I actually did happen to uncover as I was analyzing the film and thinking about it for this series. It isn't the most significant or even the strongest part of the film, but it is there, and it primarily relates to Nick Morton's journey. His journey can be summed up as one where he has to learn to make a sacrifice for something beyond his own wants or needs in order to be on a brighter path. He starts out just looking for treasure to steal, only to be scolded left and right by Halsey and his commanding officer. Then when he, Halsey, and Vale discover Ahmanet's prison, he shoots off the rope, holding her sarcophagus in a pool of mercury, and basically sets her free. He then goes on to be a cursed man, and to be regarded by Ahmanet as her chosen, due to his actions. After being forced to gun down a zombified Vale, and after being forced as well to stay aboard a plane while it's crashing down, one might say Nick Morton gets a rather rude awakening when he finds out that, because of his uncovering of Ahmanet back in Haram, he is then cursed to become her chosen vessel for Set. He tries to get away from it all, but Prodigium, called upon by Jenny Halsey, catches up to him and brings him in. Due to his curse, Morton even starts to display a sense of being seduced by Ahmanet and her dark power, when she proposes to him what he could gain if he were to join her. When Jenny tells him that there is still a good man within him, as she states the fact that he gave her the only parachute that was available on the crashing plane, Morton's response was that he thought that there was another one. Later on, after he finds out about Jekyll and Prodigium's plan to stab him intentionally, if you will, with the dagger of Set, and to turn him into evil incarnate itself, Morton resists and barters with Jekyll for a new plan, only to have to deal with both Mr. Hyde and an escaping Ahmanet. After Jenny is killed, he goes on to try to correct his mistakes, which have cost him dearly, by making an ultimate sacrifice in order to stop Ahmanet and revive Jenny. Nick Morton is a character who, throughout the course of this film, finds himself in an inner battle between taking the right path and the easy path, due to a fear of making a self-sacrifice that may lead him into an uncertain destiny where he may never come back from. It's all back and forth that culminates in him making the hardest decision in order to redeem himself for unleashing such horrors into the world. Anytime he tries to take the easy way out, it all backfires on him and he has to endure the consequences. It's only when he makes the right decisions where things turn out for the better for him. There is a solid foundation in the character of Nick Morton, and he does make for at least a compelling enough protagonist who's constantly in a gray zone throughout the film until when he is left with no other option but to make a tough call. Not to mention, while this certainly isn't the best performance of his career, Tom Cruise does fairly well in this film in terms of acting, as well as pulling off convincing stunt work during some of the film's action scenes. Then we have Dr. Jenny Halsey, played by Annabelle Wallis, an archaeologist and one of two love interests for Morton, who is later revealed to be secretly working for Prodigium. She starts out as having quite a bit of animosity towards him after he stole her map to her ROM after their one-night stand, if you will, with the intention to find and steal treasure. After Morton saves her from a plane crash, and as the film progresses, Halsey goes on to see him as a bit more of a good guy. A good guy who's kind of trapped within the cracks, but a good guy all the same. Then while they're chased by Ahmanet, Halsey is killed, only to be resurrected by Morton after he acquires godhood, and she goes on to vouch for him to Jekyll about how he may be an important ally in Prodigium's continuing fight against darkness. Halsey isn't much more than a tag-along for Morton, as the two find themselves in a perilous situation of the undead Princess Ahmanet pursuing her quarry. She has a pretty standard, straightforward arc, where she starts out with disdain for Morton ever since he stole her map and notes after they spent the night together, only to grow to think of him as a better man after he commits to acts of selflessness and self-sacrifice in order for her to live. While she's not necessarily bad in this film, Annabelle Wallis isn't really given all that much to do. It's also a bit apparent that her and Cruise don't really have the best on-screen chemistry here, despite the script trying to make it so. In summary, despite the chemistry being not quite all there between the actors, Nick Morton is a protagonist with a fairly solid arc, while Jenny Halsey serves to mainly bolster that arc. But with every hero in a story, there tends to be a villain, and in this case we have ourselves a villainess in the form of Princess Ahmanet. So, on to her. Ahmanet, played by Sofia Boutella, was a princess, as I literally just stated earlier, of ancient Egypt and an heir to the throne. She was initially meant to become queen, but her father basically hooked up with another woman, and that woman went on to give birth to a son, thus rendering Ahmanet's birthright null and void. Considering how she had worked seemingly throughout her life to gain her father's approval to become Egypt's next ruler, she didn't take the supplanting of her birthright by her stepmother and stepbrother very well. In fact, saying she didn't take it too well would be an understatement. Fueled by her rage, Ahmanet called forth Set, an Egyptian god of an insidious nature, to form a pact where he would grant her power that would allow her to exact her revenge, which all leads to her murdering her own father as well as her stepmother and stepbrother. Now the catch is that after the deed is done, Ahmanet must find a host for Set to use as a vessel so that they both can rule the world together. It almost worked. But the assassination of a king doesn't typically go unpunished, so the guards of the now deceased god king of Egypt thwarted Ahmanet's ploy to give Set his vessel, and she is mummified alive for her crimes. She is then taken all the way to Mesopotamia, known in present day as Iraq, and into an underground crypt where she would be imprisoned for all time. Flash forward by about a few millennia, Ahmanet is unwittingly set free by Nick Morton, and so she goes on to deem him as her new chosen, to become a vessel for Set. Even when she is portrayed as clearly being too far gone into the side of darkness, the film does give Ahmanet just a slight sense of tragedy to her, where all she wanted was to be her father's pride. It is still about becoming Queen of Egypt at the end of the day, but there is a sense that she felt betrayed by her father, when he found himself a new mistress to bore him a son. The Universal Monsters films of old are no strangers to giving their monster characters a sense of tragedy, where we as an audience could understand and even sympathize with these characters while also understanding why they need to be stopped. Frankenstein monster attacked and killed people due to being a confused misfit who was never given a chance to be taught any better and who had known nothing but rejection by his peers. The creature from the Black Lagoon attacked and killed due to people encroaching on its territory and attacking it first, as well as the fact that he was seeking companionship. Imhotep from The Mummy 1932 killed people who could potentially get in his way of being reunited with his long-lost love, even if it were to result in the sacrifice of a woman. The same thing can be said about Arnold Vosloo's Imhotep in the 1999 film. Jack Griffin from The Invisible Man 1933 was driven to insanity and went on to kill as a result of his madness after his experiments led to him making himself invisible, a condition which was seemingly irreversible. So now, with Ahmanet, we see a princess who was denied her long-promised birthright, and she was still seemingly at an age, as a young woman at least, where such a revelation would leave quite an impression on her. An impression that would turn the world upside down for her, and send her down a dark path, where she would be consumed by vengeance and make a deal with essentially the devil. A deal that would result in her hands being bathed in blood. A deal that, if fulfilled, could doom the whole world. One aspect about Ahmanet that people have been confused by, and understandably so, is her power set. She's immortal, obviously, no issues there because that's just the name of the game, but there's a little more. She starts out as fairly powerful, but a few harpoons and a couple of tranks into her are enough to hold her down so that she could be captured by Prodigium. But then, after she escapes, and when she encounters guards with machine guns, she isn't even the least bit fazed by them, and is able to kill those guards like those bullets don't even matter. I would say that her being taken down by harpoons and tranquilizers was a result of how she wasn't at the peak of her power at the time, as in, she didn't suck the life out of enough people yet. However, while that may still be the case, it still would have helped if the film made things just a bit more clear on what the tranks are laden with. Maybe have it be clearly established that they were laden with mercury, considering how that substance was used to contain her, and that's especially in consideration of how Jenny Halsey contacted Jekyll and Prodigium about it. Even if we had that little fix right there, it still wouldn't solve the matter of soldiers using typical machine guns against a fully powered Ahmanet for some reason, but more on that in a later part. Anyway, back to the matter of Ahmanet's power levels. Another aspect in that regard that's a bit off is that harpoons are able to hold her down even when she's just one death kiss away from being nigh unstoppable. I would think, at least by this point, she would be powerful enough to withstand harpoons and be able to overcome that obstacle, and that the soldiers should have shot some extra tranks into her just to be safe. But I guess not. Anyway, back to the positives. Sofia Boutella does a great job at portraying this character, evoking a sense of menace to her, as well as exuding a seductive quality to her. One could tell what she is thinking just by the look in her eyes. She doesn't even need to say a word in order to get the idea across, which is what I would call some good visual storytelling. Overall, despite some questionable aspects of her power level, Ahmanet is a compelling, seductive, and intimidating villainess who has a strong presence to her anytime she's on screen and when she is the focus. Now, as far as the rest of the characters go, there isn't quite as much to say. Chris Vale is a buddy sidekick of Morton/comic relief who ends up dying fairly early in the film, only to reappear as a disembodied soul who speaks with Morton about Ahmanet's plans for him after her curse takes hold. And then he's brought back to life after Morton is given the powers of Set. The way Vale is handled in this film is very much akin to An American Werewolf in London, where Jack is killed by a werewolf and ends up being a spirit who warns David Kessler, who was bitten by that same werewolf, about the curse that he's been afflicted with. The only significant difference is that Vale is a lesser version of this kind of character in terms of how the writing is executed. whereas Jack brings some very dark humor in his exchanges with David that are very well written, while also maintaining an ominous tone of the sheer danger that David is in of becoming a horrific, murderous beast. Vale comes off as a character clearly written to be someone whom we'd see in a Marvel film as comedic relief, except the humor doesn't land as effectively due to the flaws in how the film handles its overall tone. Jake Johnson is clearly trying and actually does fairly well with the role he's given. He's proven to be really good in films like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, after all. It's just a shame that he was given some of the film's weakest material. Though, granted, it could be worse. He could be in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. Yeah, full disclosure, that movie's awful. Like, really, really bad. But I oh so graciously digress. Another side character worth discussing, at least for a bit, is Greenway, Morton and Vale's superior, who is played by Courtney B. Vance. He's around to basically reprimand the two liberators of precious antiquities for falsifying a recon mission just to steal some treasure at the beginning of the film. He kinda lays it all out in an admittedly clunky way. I can't help but think that they could have written this scene in a way where the dialogue wasn't so on the nose in terms of explaining the reputation that Morton and Vale have as members of the army. There also should have been a better reason for Greenway to send Morton and Vale down with Halsey to investigate the underground tomb, despite him being totally aware of their reputation as tomb raiders. He could have sent them down on the basis of ensuring Halsey's safety, while he and some more capable soldiers keep track of any returning hostiles, perhaps. It'd be pretty fair to come to that conclusion, considering how abundant and well-armed those hostiles were, who were seen firing upon Morton and Vale earlier. So there's a chance they might come back with some reinforcements. I don't know, it just seems kind of weird for Greenway to go ahead and let the two troublemakers go down to a place where they might get an opportunity to sneak out some valuables, despite his clear awareness of what they're known for doing. Anyway, moving right along to his next significant scene, Greenway is then stabbed to death on the plane by a possessed Vale, and that's pretty much it. Courtney B. Vance, a good actor even in this bit role here, is in and out of the film just like that. I mean, it's not the most thankless role for a talented actor that I've seen. If you want to look for that, look no further than Bill Skarsgård in Marvel's Eternals. But the character of Greenway could easily have been played by anybody. So, that's all I have to say about that. Now, if I may, I would like to go into a little bit about the humor in this film. Personally, I don't hate the humor or the comic relief moments in the film, but I definitely find it to be a bit off-putting in certain scenes. For example, after a possessed Vale suddenly kills Greenway, Nick Morton is forced to gun him down. We have a beat where Morton and company take in mentally the messed up thing that had just occurred. Then he awkwardly fires the gun again at Vale's lifeless body, just out of impulse and by accident, or whatever, and passes the gun right back to a fellow soldier. Clearly, this was meant to be a moment of dark humor, except it comes off as rather misplaced because, as far as we know, Morton and Vale were compadres who shared some escapades as liberators of precious antiquities, which is bolstered by their banter earlier in the film. I'm not saying that we need to see Morton falling to his knees and shouting up to the ceiling in anguish over this like it's a Shakespearean play, but he comes off like he had just shot a spider in his bedroom as opposed to having shot a fellow soldier, let alone a fellow soldier who was by his side for seemingly quite some time, where they had like some rapport and camaraderie. So there's one example. Another example would be during the scene where Morton suddenly wakes up in the morgue after the plane crash, trying to figure out what's happening while being haunted by the ghost of Vale, which gives off a very ominous tone. Then Jenny Halsey and the people running the morgue walk in on him, and we have this awkward moment where Morton realizes he's naked and asks for whoever's in charge. It creates a tonal disconnect, because this bit of humor comes in while a more ominous moment is playing out. But I'm not done yet! Was that a bit much? Yeah, probably. Anyway, one more example would be where, after Morton hops through a double-decker bus on its side that was blown over by Ahmanet's sandstorm and tumbles inside the bus, Vale's ghost pops up out of nowhere to crack a joke about how intense the situation is. It's like, why yes, film, I see that this is intense. I kind of figured that out already. This does lead into Morton following Vale's ghost and being separated from Jenny, so there is at least a purpose behind this, which is to have Morton and Jenny separated enough to create confusion, while also bringing Morton closer to Ahmanet's grip. But maybe the joke could have been left out, or at least done differently, by making Vale say something a little more clever. Like, oh, how about, she'll look both ways before crossing, man? Or perhaps something along the lines of, may I see your bus pass, good sir? I mean, depending on how they're executed, they probably wouldn't be great jokes anyways, but it probably would have been better than, wow, that was intense. It's pretty clear with some of these examples that there was a deliberate attempt to make this film more like the MCU, which was at its peak in popularity, and I would even argue in quality, back in the mid-2010s. And it's not to say that a Universal Monsters film with humor, lighthearted or dark, is a foreign concept. In fact, a good example would be Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is considered to be a classic for its expert blending of comedy and elements of horror. That film features moments where its protagonists are narrowly trying to escape a bunch of scary monsters while providing moments of well-timed humor that doesn't undercut any of the tension. Meanwhile, we have The Mummy 2017, which features moments of levity sprinkled throughout its runtime, some well-placed, others not so much, and so the humor is very hit or miss in terms of overall execution. Now, based on my use of the phrase hit or miss, I have basically implied that there is some humor in this film that works fairly well, and actually does fit well enough. Like in the scene where Morton is being told about Prodigium's real plan, and he is in a state of confusion and trying to rationalize and barter with Jekyll over it. This is a fairly amusing scene because Morton's reaction makes sense given what he has gone through up to this point. There is also Jekyll's clinical delivery of the plan to Morton and Halsey, which adds to the banter amongst the three in an effective way. Speaking of Jekyll, we'll get to him in just a moment. Another good bit of humor is in the scene at the bar where Halsey is asking Morton about how he survived the plane crash, and all the latter could do is shrug in confusion, give a chuckle about it, and chug down some beer. Very little dialogue, no exaggerated gestures on Morton's end, just a logical response to a question about something that is seemingly impossible to answer. Good stuff. A third moment worth highlighting is during Morton and Halsey's first encounter with Ahmanet, where they try to escape her in an ambulance, only for Morton, while in the middle of some banter and declaring that the notion of Ahmanet being in his head is ridiculous, he finds himself having done a full-on U-turn back to Ahmanet. He then realizes, much to his shock, that she is in his head after all due to the curse that has been put upon him. It allows for an effective bit of humor where our hero has realized just how much he has underestimated the power of Ahmanet and her hold on him, after all the denial and confusion that he has been in up to this point. It's a neat little bit of levity before the villainess and her minions start giving chase. Okay, so one last moment to discuss here, and it's during the climax where Morton is confronting Ahmanet. After being beaten down, seemingly into submission, he's being told by Ahmanet that he will become a living god. But then, while he tries to sneak the dagger off her hands, he tells her that they're just not meant to be, and it's mainly because of her. While it's in the middle of a sequence filled with tension, it's a moment of humor that fits considering Morton's character at this point, as he is resisting Ahmanet's temptation, and it has a purpose for him to get the upper hand on her, while also doing a bit of a roast on her character. So, when it's all said and done, the humor, as I previously mentioned, is very hit or miss when it comes to not just how it lands, but also when it comes to how it is implemented throughout the film. The positive examples I used is a showcasing of how the film could have done well with some sparse or more restrained levels of humor here and there, as opposed to having humor in places where it was totally uncalled for. As it is, though, while there are worse examples of film that are meant to be darker or having a more serious tone while also trying to juggle with badly placed humor, The Mummy 2017 still could have fared better, especially given how it wouldn't have taken that much work to improve it, really. Anyway, let's get back into discussing the film's characters, as we have just one, or perhaps two, more to go. So what we have here now is Dr. Henry Jekyll and Mr. Edward Hyde. Considering how it's two characters who pretty much share the same body, I might as well cover both sides of the metaphorical coin in one section here. First, let's talk about Jekyll. Henry Jekyll is the head of Prodigium, or at least as we know of in this film. He runs the facility in London where Morton and Ahmanet are taken to after their capture. Jekyll is essentially the Dark Universe's equivalent to the MCU's Nick Fury, as many reviewers out there have commonly reported. He's very clinical and determined to rid the world of evil by any means necessary, while also trying to contain the darkness within himself. There is a rather neat exchange between him and Morton during their first scene together that hints at his backstory of how his other half came to be. This hinting at his backstory gives credence for the reason as to why Jekyll became a leader of Prodigium in the first place, perhaps to pay penance for the darkness that he may have inadvertently unleashed, as well as maybe even right the wrongs that his other half made. Flash forward to the film's final moments. Jekyll displays a sense of uncertainty about Nick Morton, despite the latter's potential to be a powerful ally with his newly acquired godhood. Understandably so, considering how Jekyll himself has a demon that he has to keep in check, much like Morton after him. Dr. Henry Jekyll serves as a solid enough character who has a pretty compelling dynamic in regards to how he runs an organization with a devoted mission to contain and destroy evil monsters while having to deal with his more monstrous side. Let's go on to Mr. Hyde, shall we? Edward Hyde is the alternate sinister personality of Dr. Jekyll. He's not given much screen time in this film. In fact, he's only prominently featured in one set piece, and that's when Nick Morton is locked in the office with him while Ahmanet sets her escape into motion. While it's fairly questionable as to why Jekyll didn't get his anti-serum into himself a bit sooner while exclaiming that Morton must be a sacrifice for the greater good, the build-up to when Mr. Hyde comes out is pretty neat. Then we see Mr. Hyde in the flesh, and he is a scary force to be reckoned with. He shows a fair amount of superhuman strength and gives off a deliciously insidious personality with a very dark sense of humor added in to spice up his characterization, showcasing how evil he is to be willing to form an alliance with Set, and how, to paraphrase The Dark Knight, he just wants to watch the world burn and cause pain on the others. This is the kind of balancing between humor and intensity that the film needed more of. A balance where the film adds some humor in that doesn't disrupt the suspense or horror elements intended to keep the audience on edge. Mr. Hyde, as he is presented in The Mummy 2017, is a large part of why his fight scene with Morton is considered to be one of the highlights of the film. Not to mention, Russell Crowe also looks to be having a lot of fun playing both personalities, being able to pull off both the calm and methodical Dr. Jekyll, who is also trying to contain the monster within himself, and the cruel and psychotic Mr. Hyde when that monster comes out. I will be going back to discussing this scene more in a later part as far as how it's implemented into the film mechanically. So for now though, I'll just include this segment by saying that Mr. Hyde was done very well, and his portrayal, along with that of Dr. Jekyll, is one of the stronger aspects of the film. So, we've gone over quite a bit here already, but I think that this is a good place to put the brakes on this series for the time being. I would like to thank you folks out there for watching this first part of my essay video series on The Mummy 2017. And I hope for you all to stay tuned for the next part, where I will be going into how the film handles its world building, as well as how it does so as an attempt to start a cinematic universe. But until then, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all later.